All right, thank you very much. Now let's move right into our next session delivered by the National Transportation Safety Board. We have Robert Hall, who is the Director of Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazardous Material Investigations at the NTSB. Robert, thank you for joining us. And we know you've been busy in the past few days, so truly appreciate taking your time to speak with our transit industry stakeholders. So with that, Robert, take it away.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ramsey. I really appreciate the opportunity to address this group today. And yes, we have been very busy. It's been a very busy weekend, and it's continued to be busy this week. Just a little background. I've been the director of this office for 8 years now, a little more than 8 years. I've been with the NTSB about 10 years. Just for a little disclosure, I used to work for DOT a number of years ago. I was in RESPA and then in PHMSA. And I also had done time as a watchstander in what was then the Crisis Management Center, which is now your TOC. So with that, let's continue and move on to my next slide. So just a little history, and this is kind of a rail-oriented history of the NTSB, but wanted to cover a couple of points that it was 1967 when the NTSB began operations on April 1st of that year. And at that time, we were part of the Department of Transportation. So we did report to the Secretary of Transportation. In 1970, we issued our first safety recommendation for positive train control on FRA regulated railroads, which certainly a number of the commuters operate on today. In 1974, we had the Independent Safety Board Act. That moved us out from under the Department of Transportation, the Secretary of Transportation. And Congress felt that that was a very important move so that our recommendations that go to the Department of Transportation would be independent. They saw a conflict of interest in the Secretary both receiving our recommendations and then being responsible for the answer to our recommendations. In 1990, we had our first most wanted list, and transit rail safety's been on the most wanted list several times. In 2008, and I'm just hitting some of the highlights, we had a Rail Passenger Disaster Family Assistance Act. And this was modeled after a similar act for airline passengers. At the current time, it only applies to intercity railroads, so that's Amtrak and the Alaska Railroad. But we do have a number of commuters that do participate in our workshops and the like. And this whole act and program is centered on taking care of the passengers and their families after an accident. In 2014, we issued a special investigation report on Metro North. Metro North had a series of 5 accidents in 10 months, several of them catastrophic. And we issued this special investigation report looking at organizational factors that led to those accidents. And that was really a large effort on our part to drill down and see why a railroad was having so many major accidents in such a short period of time. And then the last item I have on this list is our use of UAS for an accident investigation to in Grettinger, Iowa, that happened to be a freight accident, but we have using the unmanned aerial drones in accidents since then, and we've even used them in tunnels. We had another freight accident in a tunnel that connects the US and Canada between Port Huron and Sarnia, where we had hazardous material released in the tunnel. and we actually used a UAS in the tunnel for that accident. And that was a special UAS, but that is an option that we have moving forward for accidents in tunnels. Next slide, please. The National Transportation Safety Board is a board of 5 members. We currently only have 4 of the seats filled. Our chair of the National Transportation Safety Board is Jennifer Homendy. She comes to us originally from the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee on the House side of the Capitol. So she was a House staffer and is familiar with a number of the transits and the like from that work on the House side. Our board members and our chair are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Our vice chair is a board member, but they are just designated by the White House. They are not confirmed by the Senate for the position of vice chair. They're only confirmed by the Senate for the position of member. 3 of our members constitute a quorum. Our rules also require that our members no more than 3 from the same political party. Currently, we have 2. We have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. And the board members are not investigators, but our statute also requires that our board members have to have knowledge and experience in transportation. It's somewhat unique for these political positions that we actually have requirements for education and experience to serve as an NTS board member. Next slide, please. When we launch to an accident, if it's a serious accident, we do launch a board member. Initially, this past weekend, with the Washington Metro accident, we did not launch a board member, but over the weekend, we determined the need to have a board member to handle the public relations. And so Chair Homendy did become that board member. And she held a press conference on Monday morning. The role of the board members on the accident scene, they are the spokesperson for the NTSB. They provide the media with the factual information, and they update victims and families about the facts and the progress of the investigation. And they brief government officials about the progress of the investigation. And Chair Homendy did conduct several government official briefings with the House and Senate staffs, as well as members from Virginia and the district. And there's an upcoming brief with the members of the Maryland delegation later this week. Next slide, please. So the NTSB is divided into, there's 4 investigative offices. There's my office, which is Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazmat, but we also have the Office of Aviation Safety, which most of you are probably familiar with because the NTSB is often associated with major airplane crashes. And in fact, we had one just this week in Houston with a 737 crash, and we have a full team down there, including member Graham. We have an Office of Highway Safety that investigates selected highway accidents in coordination with the states. We have an Office of Marine Safety that works with the Coast Guard to investigate all major marine casualties. And next slide, please. And my office, as well as those 3 offices, are supported by an Office of Research and Engineering. That office does all the recorder analysis, so the onboard data recorders for rail vehicles will be analyzed by them, but then we'll also look at things like maintenance loggers and any sort of onboard device that stores data. They have a materials laboratory where we do the failure analysis of basically anything that breaks. We do rails, wheels, axles, even plastics. So the materials laboratory supports investigations in that regard. We have a medical group with 3 doctors. They look at all the toxicology results, as well as if a medical incident may occur as the cause of an accident, they will evaluate that, as well as help with evaluation of passenger injuries. As part of our medical work with accidents, in the event of a fatality of an employee, we will send samples to the CAMI laboratory run by the FAA in Oklahoma City, where we'll look at over 2,000 different possible constituents, drugs and other bloodborne constituents that may have been part of the cause of the accident, or may have contributed to the cause. That's much more extensive than the standard DOE testing, although that's only performed on fatalities. We have a vehicle simulations group where we can simulate the performance of rail vehicles, do braking studies and the like to support our investigation. And we also have a studies group that will look at databases. They'll look at the NTD, they'll look at the FRA database, and do data-driven studies from which we might make recommendations. Next slide, please. So my office, the Office of Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials, investigates railroads, pipeline, and hazardous materials accidents. So the interesting thing is that the hazardous materials, we investigate those for all modes of transportation. So if we have a lithium battery fire that brings down an aircraft, that would be investigated by my office in conjunction with our Office of Aviation Safety. We have 4 divisions in my office. We have the rail division that does both, does all 3: freight rail, passenger rail, and transit. We have a pipeline and hazmat division. We have a system safety division, and we have a writing editing division that produces our reports. The most of our staff is located in Washington, D.C., although we do have rail investigators throughout the country, and we have 1 pipeline investigator in Seattle. So we do have, we are geographically spread out, but about half our staff is in DC. Next slide, please. So drilling down a little further, our railroad division, we have a chief of rail, David Bucher, deputy division chief of rail, Dana Sanzo. We have 13 rail investigators that support that. The rail investigators are in the disciplines of operations, track, crashworthiness, mechanical, and signals. And our rail investigators, as I mentioned, we have half of them in DC, but we have investigators in Illinois, California, Virginia, and Colorado are some of the remote locations of the investigators. Next slide, please. Just a few accident photos of some of our accidents, and I'm sure some of you will recognize some of these. The WMATA Fort Totten accident that we investigated, the Chicago O'Hare accident where the rail car tried to ride the escalator up to the passenger terminal. The Philadelphia 188. Now that was an Amtrak accident, but it did disrupt commuter service, SEPTA service in Philadelphia for over a week. That was one of the more serious Amtrak accidents that we've investigated in recent history. Next slide, please. So the main focus that I really wanted to talk today about was what is our legislative mandate? What does Congress expect of us? So if we go to the United States Code, and this is 49 USC 1131, the Congress requires that the National Transportation Safety Board shall investigate or have investigated in detail, the board prescribes, and establish the facts, circumstances, and probable cause of, and there's a whole list of things, but the one that's important here is a railroad accident in which there is a fatality or substantial property damage, or that involves a passenger train. So let's go to the next slide and look at some definitions that are used here. These definitions come from 49 CFR 840.2. Now, that particular section, the 800 or Chapter 8 of 49 CFR are the NTSB regulations. The 840 section is the section that deals with notification of railroad accidents. So we had to define some of these things that are used in our congressional mandate. So a railroad is any system of surface transportation, persons or properties over rails. It includes, but is not limited to, line haul freight, passenger carrying railroads, rapid transit, commuter, scenic, subway, and elevated railways. Funiculars are even included, and our state safety oversight in California is well aware of that, as we've investigated Angel Flight in Los Angeles twice. The one thing that we don't investigate are things that we would consider amusements. So you can have an amusement is on a fixed guideway as well. And we define that if there's only one station and you got off where you got on, it's probably an amusement. But to that end, we've also conducted an investigation of the Disney monorail, because that is a transportation system within Disney World down in Orlando. We've investigated people movers, and not just ones that are funded through the FTA. So people movers like the Miami Airport people mover, we investigated an accident that occurred there. That was not an FTA funded transit property, but it was within our jurisdiction to investigate. So what is an accident, since we use that term? It's any collision, derailment, explosion involving railroad trains, locomotives, or cars, or any other loss-causing event involving the operation of such railroad equipment that results in a fatality to a passenger or employee, or an emergency evacuation of persons. So certainly this most recent WMATA event did not involve any fatalities, but it certainly did involve the emergency evacuation of persons. We do have another part of our regulation that has us look at if it's a safety issue of a recurring nature, that we can investigate that as well. As far as reporting, this joint operations definition is really key to reporting. When we have the commuter rails, they often operate on a host railroad. So those of you that may be familiar with VRE, which I take to the office every time I go to the office, they operate over both Norfolk Southern and CSX tracks. The importance here is that in the reporting of accidents, it is the host railroad that's required to report. So If VRE had an accident near the Woodbridge station on CSX tracks, it would be CSX that is the responsible party to report that accident. And we also define what a fatality means. It's the death of a person that occurs within 24 hours of the accident. So if someone is seriously injured and dies a week later, that's not considered a fatality under our definitions. Next slide, please. Notification of railroad accidents. I understand that through FTA, FTA is asked that the RTAs report their accidents to the TOC. We still have a requirement within our regulation that requires transits and all rail operators to report to the National Response Center. That's how we get our information for making our launch decisions. So within 2 hours, we require a railroad to report passenger or employee fatality or serious injury of 2 or more crew members, or passengers requiring admission to the hospital, the evacuation of a passenger train. I don't think any of the transits carry tank cars, but that's a reporting requirement, or a facility or a fatality at a grade crossing. And again, grade crossings, they do exist in the commuter rails, and there may be an occasional grade crossing within a transit property, but in general, transits don't tend to have grade crossings. And then there's a 4-hour requirement. And again, as I said, on the joint railroads, joint operations, it's the railroad that controls the track where the accident occurred that is responsible for making that notification. And then when a notification occurs in a remote area, which really doesn't, I believe, apply to commuters or transits, it's the time that the railroad became aware of the accident that the clock starts. So with that, let me answer some questions. And I know there was a question about operations during during the pandemic, what we've been doing during the pandemic. We did continue our operations. We modified them a little bit to do some actual virtual launches. But at this point in time, we are back to our normal posture of sending teams out to investigations and are no longer doing the virtual launches at this point. But I believe there may be some other questions, so let me open it up to questions.
All right, thank you. We have a number of questions here, and if you don't mind, I can read some of these off for you.
That would be great, thank you.
All right, so the first question is, how did the Lac-Mégantic derailment become an NTSB highlight? That happened in Canada, didn't it?
Yes, it did. And we have a very strong relationship with the Canadian Transportation Safety Board. And when that particular accident occurred, they requested our assistance on that accident. Also, it's important to understand that the railroad the carrier that was involved in that is a railroad that's a cross-border railroad, so they operate on both sides of the border, and the train actually originated in North Dakota. So we had a stake in the investigation as well, but we actually sent 5 investigators up there to assist with that horrific accident.
All right, thank you for clarifying that. The second question, in your opinion, what is the most effective thing, be it a procedure or physical infrastructure, a rail agency can implement to make grade crossings safer, short of getting rid of them?
Well, certainly, and when we look at the history of grade crossings and how Operation Lifesaver helped move the needle on that, bringing them down. Although in the past couple of years they haven't moved much further down, but they've moved down considerably. There are grants that are available through FRA for grade crossing improvements, and of course that certainly affects the commuter railroads, where you go through a staged improvement. You may begin with a private crossing that only has crossbucks, and add lights, and then add lights and bells, and then add gates, and then add 4 quadrant gates. So all of these improvements can be made to a grade crossing to help to eliminate that. But of course, the best improvement that gets made is when you do a grade separation, so that the two are not acting on the same elevation. And in fact, that's something that Amtrak had done to the Northeast Corridor a number of years ago, was to eliminate all at-grade crossings in the Northeast Corridor between Washington and New York.
Right, thank you for that. Now, a moment ago, you responded to this question, but perhaps you could expand a bit more. Can you tell us about how the pandemic has affected NTSB's operations?
Well, from a standpoint of investigating, I mentioned we did some virtual launches where we would meet with the parties over Teams and conduct the interviews and work on the launches in that regard. But we also saw a rather dramatic increase or decrease in passenger accidents. So we really saw a reduction, at least in the early stages of the pandemic, in passenger accidents. And we believe most of that was due to the reduction in passenger service offered by commuters and Amtrak and the like. Yeah, I'm still here.
Hello, Robert. It's Patrick Neiman's here. Sorry about any confusion here. Dr. Ramsey had some technical difficulties, so we're working that out with him.
Oh, okay.
And I don't have a set of the questions here, any more questions that came in. But if there's anything else you'd like to elaborate on that, based on the questions that have come in, or anything that other than your presentation that you'd like to cover, we would love to hear from you.
Well, yeah, let me talk a little bit about how we conduct an accident. We use something called the party system. So when we launch to an accident, we invite the principal parties to be parties to our investigation, and that would include the operator, the RTA themselves, the union if they're unionized. The state safety oversight would be a party to our investigation, and as well as local emergency responders. So those particularly involved in the accident would be invited to be parties. And what we do in the investigation in those early stages is all information regarding the accident is shared with all the parties. And we encourage that the parties, if they see the need to take immediate action, that they do so based on the information. That's why we're making sure everything is shared. And that really played into this recent metro accident, all the information was being shared, and the state safety oversight took their actions independent of our investigation. And we strongly encouraged that. We strongly supported the actions that they took. You know, that's a good part of our investigation, is this sharing of information that occurs.
Great, thank you, sir. Dr. Ramsey? Or do we have you back?
We'll see. This wouldn't have been complete if I didn't have a technical issue. All right, so to jump back in, which question were we on? My apologies, everyone.
I think it was
okay, so you just respond to that. Thank you. All right, so question number 5. It says part 840.3 only offers a phone number for reporting to the National Response Center. Is there an email to make the notifications?
I am not aware of an email for notifications. I can certainly research that and provide that information back through FTA, but I'm not aware that the NRC has an email or an online notification process.
All right. The next question. Given the huge number of notifications the NTSB probably receives through the NRC every year, what criteria does the NTSB use in determining whether to launch?
All right, well, we do receive a huge number. It's about 2,000 notifications a year. We have a duty officer that gets the notifications in an overnight report. Well, there's 2 ways the duty officer gets notifications. For a very serious accident, they will get it. We'll get an immediate notification from the NRC, or in our response operations center that monitors television 24/7, they will actually create a notification to go to the duty officer. So a dozen notifications a day roughly go to the duty officer. The duty officer will screen those against a criteria. They're looking for fatalities, they're looking for serious incidents, and they send a report to me every morning based on the overnight reports that we go through with any recommendations for a launch. Now, notifications that come to me, they trim it down from about 2,000. I look at probably 100 to 150 notifications a year where we do extensive follow-up and get more information. And from that, we weed it down to 12 to 15 that we launch on a year. So we're only doing 12 to 15 rail launches a year, but that's at the bottom of the funnel. But it's this NRC duty officer comes to me, and if it's a serious accident, I will take it to the chair. By regulation, the launch decision is delegated to me as the director. So I am the one that's making the launch decisions.
All right, thank you. Our next question. Does the NTSB define grade crossings as a crossing that includes railroad protection, such as gates, or does it also consider a traffic signal controlled intersection a grade crossing, which are typically used in light rail, streetcar that lack crossbucks, flashers, etc.?
We don't really have a definition of grade crossing, but we will look at accidents that occur on light rail in a traffic control system. That is something, if a train is involved, that is something that we would look at. Now, typically when we start looking at grade crossing accidents, we are interested in a couple of things because there are some 250 reported grade crossing accidents a year with fatalities. We're particularly interested in those accidents where fatalities occur on the train, or those accidents where it's a failure of the signal system. So those are ones that we would likely launch on. A good example in the commuter rail, one of our larger, was the one in Metro North, Valhalla, where we had 5 people that were killed on the train car itself, because the third rail penetrated the train car and caused blunt force injuries to the passengers that had died. So, you know, we're particularly interested in those type of accidents because of looking at rail car crash worthiness.
All right, thank you for that response. We have one more question. 840.2B uses, quote, or the emergency evacuation of persons. 840.2A2 uses, quote, the evacuation of a passenger train, which is more general. Would you agree non-emergency evacuations to the to the right-of-way due to a disabled train would not require NTSB reporting?
That's a good question. I will tell you, I really would have to ask my general counsel that, but that's not something we're going to launch on. So if I don't hear about it, it doesn't bother me that I haven't heard about it, because typically we don't use evacuations as a launch criteria in and of themselves. And part of the reasoning behind that is evacuations are very subjective, particularly when you get to the emergency responders. Some will take a very conservative approach and conduct large evacuations, and others won't. And so the measure of an evacuation really isn't a measure of the accident that occurred.
Right, thank you for that. And Robert, it looks like we've reached the end of the questions here today, and you shared a lot of great information. So attendees, let's give Robert a hand as loud as possible. And Robert, thank you for your time, sir.
Certainly, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to address this group, and keep us in mind in the future, and particularly if you're interested in something specific, we'd certainly be happy to brief this group on investigations that have been closed. So if you would like to get a detailed brief of an investigation after we've issued the report, we could certainly do that in this forum.
All right, we appreciate that offer, and we'll take that in consideration.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Have a fantastic afternoon. Now, for everyone else, we know what time it is. We will do our last 4 questions here to rate the session, and then we will take a break and return at 3:45. So this is going to be our last break.